My name is Matt Pacenza. I'm the Executive Director for HEAL Utah, and I just wanted to add a few minutes of context and comments on the Clean Power Plan and how Utah will implement it. Noticeably absent so far in this morning's hearing has been any sense of the problem. Why are we even trying to address this? And I'm not a scientist, but I think it would be great if this committee, perhaps at a later interim hearing, brought in a panel of researchers from Utah State, BYU. There's a bunch of folks out there who are putting together really good data on how climate change is affecting the state of Utah. So I think it's a tough conversation to have about the price we might pay to address a problem if we haven't talked about the problem actually happening. I've been through a few of those presentations recently, and probably the single greatest impact, as folks wouldn't be surprised to find out, is reduced snowpack, particularly at higher elevations, actually particularly at lower elevations. And I've got some graphs here that I can't show you, but they show really clearly that we're having significantly reduced snowpack. That's affecting our water supplies, it's affecting our forests, it's affecting our agriculture. So those are costs we're already paying now, and I think it's important to think about that as we figure out what to do about it. Just as an example, both Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County have, of course, declared water advisories. We're only in the month of May, and they were already putting out advisories because, 80% of our water supplies here on the Wasatch Front.
It's rained every day since.
Right, but 80% of our water comes from snowpack, so even rain is a fairly modest part of that. The Clean Power Plan's targets are very modest. The one thing Representative Ivory and I can agree upon is it's not nearly enough. Those targets are not nearly where we need to go.
For the record, I think you're putting words in my mouth. I don't know that is anything close to what I said.
Okay. But given the ongoing growth in renewables, the movement away from coal toward natural gas, America got 60% of its electricity from coal about 20 years ago, and we're down in the low 40s now. So we're already moving in this direction. And the emphasis on energy efficiency, they're really, frankly, not hard targets to meet at all. I've carefully read Dr. Stewart and Cody Nelson's comments to the EPA, and to be frank, I think we are somewhat disappointed in how Utah is reacting. Dr. Nelson didn't put out a number for how much she thought costs would increase to ratepayers, but actually in those comments to the EPA she did, and they suggested as much as 20%. And they quoted an outfit called the National Economic Research Associates, NERA. NERA was commissioned to do that study on what the Clean Power Plan would cost by America's coal and oil and gas industries. Folks that are much, much smarter than I have kind of dismantled the logic behind that 20% number, and you folks don't have time for me to go into that today. But I'll point out one thing they did which got them to that number. And that was they used an estimate for the cost of energy efficiency at 10.6 cents a kilowatt hour. That's a huge number. It's a gigantic number. And as folks may know, it's always cheaper to save a kilowatt than it is to burn coal or burn natural gas to make a new one. It's cheaper to put insulation in a building, to replace windows, to lower thermostats, to do those kind of things. Great work, by the way, that Rocky Mountain Power and Questar and others are doing. There's a giant federal meta study where they looked at all the research on how much energy efficiency costs, and they came up with a number which is 4.5 cents. The EPA and their estimates for what the Clean Power Plan will cost, which of course is relatively little, used a conservative number, which is 6.5 cents. So they were being careful. NERA, this industry-funded group, used 10.6. So that's the main way they got to that 20% number that Dr. Nelson and Cody Stewart used in their comments. One of the things I wanted to point out is that if you go back through America's history of environmental safeguards and regulations, you'll find that every time anything is proposed, we're told it's going to be enormously expensive. There's a terrific website I'd urge people to check out called the Cry Wolf Project. And I'm not going to bore you folks with all the different examples, but I just have to put out a couple here. So in 1970, Lee Iacocca was the head of Ford Motor Company, and he went to the Clean Air Act had just been proposed, and he went to Congress and said if it was passed, it would stop the production of automobiles. In 1972, GM went to Congress and said if they had to put catalytic converter systems into cars, again, it would stop all automobile production. In 1979, we were proposing taking lead out of gasoline, and DuPont, Monsanto, and Dow issued a statement that if we took lead out of gasoline, the jobs of 29 million Americans would be threatened. In 1990, when we took CFCs out of our refrigeration technologies, which is really a wonderful program adopted by President Reagan that's really helped save the ozone layer. The air conditioning trade group went to Congress and said that it would shut down all refrigeration in supermarkets, office buildings, hotels, and hospitals. And I was alive in the 90s, and I don't recall that being a particularly steamy decade, so I think we did manage to dodge that bullet. So I do find it interesting that, we're all immensely proud of the innovation that drives our economy. And for some reason, our faith in that innovation stops when it comes to pollution control and when it comes to our ability to transition to a clean energy economy. I have tremendous faith that we can do that. These are modest targets. I think we can meet them. One last point, and this has come up a bit obliquely in some of the statements from the utility folks and Dr. Nelson, that Utah, in its letters to the EPA, was suggesting that we should get some credit for renewable energy projects that are sited here, but whose electricity doesn't actually go to our ratepayers. And as folks I'm sure know, by far the best example of that is the Milford Wind Farm. Really a giant project, 300 megawatts of wind power down in Milford. That power is paid for by ratepayers of 2 Southern California utility districts. That power goes directly to their grid. That power only exists because California, unlike Utah, has a binding renewable portfolio standard. And because its utilities and its ratepayers went out, looked for that resource, funded that resource, they're paying for that resource is powering their homes. From our perspective, and I think from the EPA's, the purpose of the Clean Power Plan is to reduce the carbon output of the power that we consume. And so we are hopeful that as this process moves forward, that's our focus, that we try to figure out how can we reduce the carbon output of the electricity that we consume here in Utah. By the way, that means that the Wyoming wind, for example, that Pacificor produces, a proportion of which comes to Utah, perfectly reasonable that we claim a certain amount of credit for that. But I think the Milford Wind Farm does belong to the good folks of Southern California. So that ends our comments today. We're hopeful that we can figure out how to make this thing work instead of trying to fighting it. It's a really modest plan, and we can get there without too much trouble.
Thank you for your time.
So I have a few questions for you. The question I asked Dr. Nelson early on, we're talking about trying to reduce CO2, right?
That's correct.
So do you know what percentage of total CO2 the power plants comprise?
I do know that coal power is the single largest producer of carbon as a sector in the American economy.
How does it compare to wildfires? How does it compare to volcanoes? How does it comper to our expiration?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
How does it compare to decaying plants? Do you have that data?
Yeah, I think so there's anthropogenic, and then there's the, this stuff that is natural. And I think the ratios are sort of 2 to 1. So we sort of are responsible for, 2/3 of the pie. Then you have to break that down from electricity generation, transportation, and then everything else. And transportation and electricity generation are the 2 big things for us to go after.
So do you know what the impact on CO2 is from all of the regulatory regime that's being proposed?
Yeah, I think the number used is 1%, and given, that America is a fairly, modest proportion of the world's population, that sounds about right. But I'm sure, Representative Ivory, there's a bunch of issues that you care deeply about, that you recognize that the actions that we take might be a small part of the solution. But that shouldn't keep us from leading and trying.
Right, but so you mentioned transition, and I don't know that there's anyone that doesn't want healthier lands, more accessible lands, and yet also productive lands. If you don't have a job, that's not environmentalism. If you don't have a roof over your head and you have no food to eat, that's not environmentalism. In fact, we had Dr. Jeff McCarthy, the Director of Environmental Humanities from University of Utah, testify to one of our committees on that very subject. And so it's a matter of striking a balance. Have you ever operated a power plant?
No, sir, I haven't. I'd love to answer that jobs question quick. There's a ton of great research on sort of jobs per energy unit produced, and by far the greatest job growth we get is from energy efficiency. And if you think about it, that makes sense. You're paying skilled tradespeople to put insulation in buildings, to replace windows. It's carpenters and construction folks. Burning a rock to make electricity does produce jobs. There's no doubt about it. But relatively, it's a relatively modest amount of jobs compared to other things.
So you mentioned the word transition, and yet you just said you've never operated a power plant. Have you ever been a regulatory compliance advisor for an energy company power plant?
No, I mean, I'm a policy person that's
Right,
capable of
and
reading
so-
reports from other people, just like you.
Right, and so when we look at everything that happens about where we are today in our life, we're in a world now that is based on an infrastructure developed largely on a fossil fuel system. And you mentioned the word transition. Well, what's happening is an arbitrary rule with, as we heard repeatedly, without any partnership, without any opportunity to transition, that's being imposed with deadlines that we've heard repeatedly that are almost designed to fail. That's not a transition.
You know, I don't
That's
agree
a
with that at
cliff.
all. I honestly don't agree with that at all, sir. It's a target. It's a numerical target. You have to have a 30% reduction by 2025. How you get there
and
is
the
up to
consequence on that target is we lose jurisdictional control and governing control.
I mean, effective
over
regulation
energy
has to have a stick.
in our state,
But
right?
how you get to that target is up to you. You
Let's,
talk and choose to
this
get
is
to that
just-
target.
This is just turning into a debate. Let's go on with our presentation. If you want to endorse nuclear power, that's fine. I didn't think he's going to, but anyway, any other questions? Senator Van Tassel, did you have one? Or?
No, I was going to.
So,
Great. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thanks.